My wife got pregnant by her boss and tried to hide it from me. I build furniture for a living, real furniture, not decorative nonsense, but solid work for offices, hotels, and large homes, the kind where precision matters and mistakes cost real money. My hands know wood better than most people know their friends, and my salary reflects that I live comfortably in a good American state, the kind with clean streets, reasonable taxes, and neighbors who wave but do not pry. My wife, Emma, and I had what people like to call a stable life, a house with a porch, a garage that always smelled like fresh pine, and weekends that followed a predictable rhythm, coffee, errands, small jokes about nothing. I liked that rhythm. It felt earned. Emma worked in marketing, downtown presentations, meetings, smiles that stayed polite. Even when people were not. Her boss was a man named Grant. She mentioned him casually, demanding, smart, intense. I never felt threatened. Jealousy always seemed like a weak material to me, cheap, shiny, and unreliable. I trusted my measurements in life as much as I trusted them at work. Then one evening Emma came home early, which was rare. She stood in the kitchen, holding a small white box like it weighed more than it should. Her smile was careful, not happy, not scared, just controlled. She said, "Guess what?" And my mind ran through logical options: promotion, bonus, trip, something ordinary, something earned. Instead, she said, "I am pregnant." The room did not spin. There was no shouting, no dramatic pause. There was just a quiet recalculation in my head, like when you realize a blueprint scale is off. I asked how far along, and she hesitated for half a second, which was enough. Then she said, "Almost 10 weeks." 10 weeks landed heavily, because I know dates, I know timelines. I had been traveling during that window, working on a hotel project, sleeping alone, calling home at night, tired but content. I looked at Emma, and she avoided my eyes for just a moment too long. She started talking fast about surprises and miracles and how life never follows plans. I nodded, smiled, even hugged her, because panic never helped anyone, especially not me. That night after she fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, counting not sheep, but days, flights, receipts, hotel rooms, everything lined up too cleanly for comfort. Suspicion is not an emotion, it is a calculation, and my calculation told me something was wrong. But I did not accuse, I did not ask questions. I waited, because wood reveals its flaws when you apply pressure, not when you stare at it. The next day, Emma asked me to call a friend from her phone because mine was dead. I picked it up, unlocked it without thinking, scrolled to find the contact. And there it was, not hidden, not deleted, just sitting there, a message thread with Grant. The words were not graphic, not explicit, but they were clear: plans, reassurances, references to timing, to not worry, to how everything would work out. My chest felt tight, but my face stayed calm. Years of negotiation and client meetings had trained me well. I finished the call, put the phone down, kissed Emma on the cheek, and went to work as usual. By lunchtime, I had already called a lawyer. By the end of the day, I had booked a week off under the excuse of rest. Sometimes the smartest move is not confrontation, but distance, and that is where my story truly began. I did not pack much for that week away, just a bag, clothes, a notebook, and the calm that comes when a decision has already been made. I left early before Emma woke up, left a note that said I needed air, which was true, just not in the way she would later understand. I drove without music at first, letting my thoughts settle like sawdust after a cut. I went somewhere quiet, a place with trees and water, and no one who knew my name, the kind of place where you can hear your own thinking clearly. I ignored every call, including hers, not out of cruelty, but out of discipline. I knew if I answered, I would hear explanations, emotions, tears, and I was not ready to waste energy on noise. I spent that week walking, thinking, eating simple food, and writing down facts, not feelings. Facts like timelines, financial accounts, property ownership, legal options. The lawyer I spoke to was calm, professional, almost bored, which I appreciated. He confirmed what I already suspected, that the evidence I had was enough, and that silence was my ally. People expect anger. They are unprepared for quiet. By the fourth day, Emma stopped calling every hour and switched to messages, long ones, apologetic, defensive, hopeful, sometimes all at once. I did not read them fully. I skimmed just enough to confirm there was no new information, only emotional inflation. I slept well that week, better than I had in months. Clarity has that effect. When I returned home, Emma was waiting, her eyes red, her hands restless. She started talking immediately, saying it was a mistake, saying she was confused, saying Grant had manipulated her, saying the baby complicated everything. I let her speak, because interruption is another form of emotion, and I was done with that. I listened until she ran out of words. Then I handed her a folder. Inside were Printed messages, dates, highlighted notes from my lawyer, and divorce papers. Already prepared, her face changed not into anger, but into panic. She said we could fix it. She said I should listen. She said marriage meant forgiveness. I said nothing, picked up my keys, and left again, that time for good. I moved into a short-term rental and let the legal process work the way systems are designed to work. Slow, steady, inevitable. Friends reached out. I kept explanations short. Truth does not need decoration. Emma tried once more to meet in person, said she needed closure. I told her closure was a luxury item, and I was no longer shopping in that store. The divorce finalized without drama. She moved out, kept the house temporarily, then sold it to cover her own changes in life. I focused on work, poured my attention into a new line of custom designs, secured a large contract, expanded my team's success. Came not as revenge, but as consequence. 2 years passed quietly. I met someone new, not as a replacement, but as a partner. Someone who valued honesty as much as stability. We built a different life. One based on reality, not performance. Sometimes people ask how I stayed so calm, how I did not break. The answer is simple. I knew my worth long before anyone tried to discount it. And when a structure is compromised, the strongest move is not to patch it emotionally, but to rebuild from solid ground. And this time I chose better materials. People think the hardest part was discovering the messages or hearing the word pregnant attached to someone else's shadow, but the truth is the hardest part came later, in the quiet, after the legal dust settled, when routines disappear and you are left alone with yourself. I threw myself into work, not to escape, but to sharpen focus. I redesigned my workshop workflow, invested in better machinery, trained 2 apprentices who actually listened and trusted my judgment. Contracts grew, larger clients, stopped questioning my rates, and started asking about availability. Respect is subtle, it arrives when you stop asking for it. Emma tried to rewrite history through mutual friends saying I was cold, that I never fought for us. I let those stories float, because arguing with fiction gives it oxygen. I knew the facts, and so did the paperwork. One afternoon, I received a call from Grant, not apologizing, not threatening, just testing boundaries. He said he wanted to clear the air. I said air clears itself when you stop polluting it, and ended the call. After that, he disappeared from my life entirely, as he should have. Solitude taught me something important. Loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of self-trust. Once I rebuilt that, everything else aligned. I started going to industry events again, not as someone half distracted, but as a man fully present. I spoke on panels about sustainable materials and long-term design, thinking people listened, and I enjoyed the irony of teaching stability after surviving chaos. It made me smile in private moments. I bought a new place, smaller, smarter, designed exactly to my taste, every shelf, every joint intentional. No compromises. I hosted friends again, laughed, easily cooked meals without tension. Then one evening at a charity event, I met Claire. She asked smart questions about wood sourcing and laughed at dry humor, which is always a good sign. We talked without urgency, without performance, just 2 adults exchanging curiosity. She did not ask about my past right away, and when she did later, it was without judgment. Time passed naturally. We dated slowly, traveled lightly, built trust piece by piece, like any good structure. When I eventually told her everything, she listened, then said, "That sounds like someone who knows when to walk away." I agreed and realized that was the real victory, not success, not a new family, not even peace, but discernment, the ability to recognize when something no longer deserves your energy and to leave without burning yourself in the process. And that lesson, once learned, never really leaves you. I realized after your message that I had been too restrained, and restraint, while useful in life, is terrible for storytelling. So let me slow down and widen the lens, because those 2 years were not a montage. They were a season of quiet tests, small moments where character is either reinforced or quietly eroded, and mine was reinforced daily in ways no one applauds. I woke up alone in that rental apartment the first morning after the papers were filed, and the silence felt heavier than furniture-grade oak. I stood there with a mug of coffee and understood something very clearly, that no one was coming to rescue me, and that was fine, because I had never built anything worthwhile by waiting for rescue. I rebuilt my routines deliberately, mornings at the gym, evenings in the workshop, weekends planned instead of endured. I audited my finances, not because I was afraid, but because control is calming when life has proven it can surprise you. I expanded my client base outside the state, traveled more by choice this time, not obligation. Hotels no longer felt like exile. They felt like strategy. Emma sent emails, long reflective ones, full of regret and spiritual vocabulary she had recently acquired. I did not reply, not out of anger, but because responses create dialogue, and dialogue implies possibility, and that chapter was structurally unsound. I heard through acquaintances that her boss had promised support, then delivered distance, that the reality of shared responsibility was less poetic than the messages suggested. I felt no satisfaction in that knowledge, just confirmation of patterns. I focused instead on growth. I hired a business consultant, renegotiated supplier contracts, invested in sustainable hardwood sourcing, which brought in a higher tier of clientele, people who cared about longevity, not trends. My name started circulating in circles I had once only observed from the edge. Invitations replaced cold calls, interviews replaced pitches. Success, when it comes quietly, is easier to live with. I designed my new home myself, every corner intentional, no wasted space, no borrowed taste. Friends joked that it felt like walking inside my mind, clean lines, warm textures, no chaos, and that made me laugh because it was true. Claire entered my life during this phase not as a dramatic turning point, but as a steady addition. She had her own career, her own opinions, and no interest in fixing me, which was refreshing. We talked about books, economics, travel, and the strange ways people avoid accountability. We disagreed calmly, which I found deeply attractive. Conflict without manipulation is underrated. When she eventually met my friends, they liked her not because she tried, but because she did. Not I slept better, laughed more, and trusted again, not blindly, but intelligently. One evening, sitting on my porch watching the light fade, she asked if I ever regretted how I left. I thought about it carefully, then said no, because staying would have taught me to tolerate disrespect, and I refused to master that skill. She smiled and said that was the healthiest answer she had heard in years, and in that moment I knew that the life I was living now was not a reaction to betrayal, but a result of alignment with my own standards. And that is the kind of ending that does not feel like an ending at all. People assume success arrives like applause, loud, immediate, impossible to ignore, but for me it crept in quietly, disguised as consistency, and that made it far more dangerous, because quiet success attracts attention from the past, and the past rarely knocks politely. The first sign came through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned Emma in a casual tone, said she asked about me, asked how I was doing, asked if I ever talked about her anymore. I smiled and said no, which was true, not because I was suppressing anything, but because she had slowly become irrelevant. Like an old supplier you stop calling once you find better materials. The acquaintance looked surprised, as if indifference was ruder than anger. That reaction amused me. Later, Claire and I discussed how people expect pain to linger because it justifies their own choices. I expanded my company again, took on a major commercial contract that required relocating part-time to another city. The decision would have scared the old version of me. Disruption, travel, uncertainty, but now it felt like momentum. Claire supported it without hesitation, which told me more about her character than any romantic speech ever could. We adjusted schedules, communicated clearly, and trusted each other without surveillance, which felt revolutionary compared to my past. One evening, after a long site visit, I received a message from an unknown number. It was Emma. She wrote that she knew she should not contact me, but she needed to explain things properly this time. She said becoming a mother had changed her, that she finally understood responsibility, that she wanted forgiveness, not reconciliation, just peace. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it down unanswered, not because I wanted to punish her, but because forgiveness does not require access and peace does not require my participation. I slept well that night, which confirmed the decision. Work intensified, deadlines tightened, and I thrived under pressure. Delivered designs ahead of schedule, impressed stakeholders, and secured follow-up projects. My team grew stronger, my leadership style sharpened, calm, direct, no theatrics. People perform better when they are not afraid, and I had learned that the hard way. During a conference panel, someone asked me how I handled betrayal in business partnerships. I paused, smiled slightly, and said, I do not confuse potential with commitment. The audience laughed, but they understood. Claire and I moved in together, not dramatically, just practically, two households merging with Discussion, respect, and humor about whose coffee machine was superior. We hosted dinners, talked late into the night, planned travel, without needing escape from our own lives. Occasionally, someone would bring up my past marriage, and I noticed something interesting. I spoke about it like a case study, not a wound. The emotion had been processed, filed away, learned from. One afternoon, I ran into Emma unexpectedly at a grocery store, the kind of coincidence life enjoys. She looked older, not in years, but in posture. Her smile was careful, mine was polite. We exchanged brief words about health, work, weather, nothing of substance. Then she said, "I am glad you are doing well," and for the first time I believed it. I wished her well genuinely, and walked away without weight in my chest. That moment felt like crossing an invisible line where the past no longer had leverage. Later that evening, I told Claire about it. She listened, then said, "That must feel like closure." I shook my head and said, "No, it feels like freedom." Closure still keeps the door in sight. Freedom means you forget which wall it was on. And as I said it, I realized how far I had come, not by erasing pain, but by refusing to let it define my architecture. The man I was becoming was not shaped by betrayal, but by the decisions I made afterward, calm, deliberate, and always forward. Life settled into a rhythm that felt earned, not borrowed. Mornings started early, workouts, then coffee on the porch, emails answered before most people woke up. I liked being ahead of the day. It made surprises manageable. Claire and I learned each other in small, practical ways: how she needed quiet before speaking in the morning, how I needed structure before relaxation. We respected those differences and never tried to turn them into flaws. That mutual respect became the quiet engine of our relationship. Work continued to expand. I opened a second workshop, hired a manager I trusted, and stepped back from daily operations, which gave me something new: time. I used it carefully, mentoring younger builders, speaking at trade schools, and investing in projects that aligned with my values. Durability, transparency, long-term thinking. People started asking for advice, not just designs, and I realized influence grows when ego shrinks. One afternoon, my lawyer called, not with a problem, but with an update. Emma had finalized matters related to the child, and there were no remaining loose ends legally or financially. I thanked him, hung up, and felt nothing dramatic, no sadness, no anger, just completion, like closing a file you have not opened in years. Later that week, Claire and I talked about starting a family. The conversation was calm, thoughtful, grounded in reality, not fantasy. We discussed schedules, responsibilities, support systems, and expectations, which might not sound romantic, but felt deeply reassuring. Romance built on logistics lasts longer than romance built on adrenaline. I thought back to the night Emma announced her pregnancy and how blindsided I felt then, compared it to now, where nothing felt hidden or rushed. Everything was chosen intentionally. We took a short trip out west, hiked, talked, laughed about small things, sat quietly watching sunsets without feeling the need to fill silence. That kind of comfort cannot be faked. It arrives only when trust has been tested and passed. I occasionally reflected on the man I used to be, not with regret, but with appreciation. He had stayed calm when chaos invited reaction. He had chosen dignity over drama and patience over impulse. Those choices compounded over time into the life I was now living. People often misunderstand strength. They think it is loud, confrontational, unforgiving, but real strength is quiet. It listens, it plans, it walks away without needing the last word. I never confronted Grant publicly, never argued with Emma, never demanded apologies, and yet I lost nothing of value. Instead, I gained clarity, direction, and peace. The past became a reference point, not a residence, and that distinction changed everything. As I stood in my workshop one evening, watching my team finish a project, I felt a sense of pride, not just in the work, but in the path that led me there. Betrayal had not broken me, it had refined me, like pressure refining grain, and I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it with the same steady hands and clear measurements that had carried me this far. Because once you learn to trust yourself fully, the future stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like raw material ready to be shaped. The final lesson came quietly, the way all real lessons do, not announced, not dramatic, just clear. One ordinary morning, I was standing in the workshop, sunlight cutting through the dust, the smell of wood familiar, comforting, and I realized I was genuinely happy, not excited, not relieved, but steady, and that steadiness felt like wealth. Claire was pregnant by then, and the news did not arrive with shock or fear, it arrived with readiness. We had planned, talked, adjusted, prepared, not just emotionally, but practically schedules, savings, responsibilities. Nothing was left to improvisation, and that made all the difference. I thought back to the man I was years earlier, staring at a ceiling, counting days, flights, facts instead of feelings, and I felt gratitude for him. He had not panicked, he had not begged, he had not compromised his values for the illusion of peace. He had chosen silence over shouting, distance over desperation, and dignity over comfort. Those decisions had shaped everything that followed. Emma faded completely from my mental landscape, not out of bitterness, but irrelevance. People do not haunt you when they no longer represent unfinished business. Occasionally someone would mention her name, and it would land like a word in a foreign language, familiar, but without meaning. My focus stayed forward on my family, my work, my integrity. I taught my apprentices not just how to cut, measure, and assemble, but how to think long-term, how shortcuts always invoice you later, how integrity is not moral decoration, but structural necessity. Claire and I built a home together, this time literally and figuratively, choosing materials, layouts, and habits with intention. Every room reflected collaboration, not compromise. The day our child was born, I held that small life with calm certainty, no doubt, no confusion, just presence. And in that moment, I understood the full arc of my story. Betrayal had been the catalyst, not the conclusion. It had forced me to examine who I was and who I refused to become. I did not win by outdoing anyone or proving anything publicly. I won by living well, quietly, consistently, on my own terms. And if there is a moral in all of this, it is simple: when someone shows you they cannot be trusted, believe them once, then trust yourself enough to walk away, build better, and never look back. Because the strongest revenge is not success, it is peace, and the strongest victory is knowing you never lost yourself along the way.